So hello, Professor Howden. Thank you so much for being here today for this interview with me. Your knowledge and insight on climate change will be so dearly needed, and I know that the community will really love your expertise. So my first question to you is, you are the director of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University. What does this role typically involve?
Well, it's a pretty complex role, and in fact, the Institute just within this week has been expanded to include energy and disasters. And so it's now called the sort of ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, because I wanted to put the solutions in there because people want answers. They actually want to know what to do about this. So what would I do? So some of that, this is interacting with researchers and working with them to find new questions and new ways of addressing questions. And so having input into science and research of different types. And I research everything from sort of climate science, looking at climate records and how they've changed and that sort of thing, through to social science. So I work with farmers and many other stakeholders across different regions. So we take social science out into there, and even in ethics. And so I publish on ethics and ethics in science as well. And so that's some of the job. Some of it's working with stakeholders, like briefing ministers or government department staff. Some of it's doing media work. So I do quite a lot of interviews of different types on TV and radio and print media, etc. And I also act as an advisor to a whole range of different groups. So I'm on the ACT Climate Change Council. I've got about a dozen different advisory roles. Some of them are relatively small and some of them are pretty big. And I'm a vice chair on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so I sort of do that side of things as well. So at the moment, those advisory roles are roughly split half and half between the national ones and the international ones.
Yeah, as you just stated, you work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is outstanding. Can you explain a bit about this organisation, particularly its purpose and your involvement with them?
Sure. So in terms of my involvement, I actually think I'm the longest standing Ipcc participant ever. And I think I've actually performed, been in more Ipcc roles than anyone else as well. So I've had a lot of engagement over a long time. So I first engaged with Ipcc in 1991, developing the greenhouse gas inventories for agriculture, and those are still in play. They're still the ones that we use globally, and then I've had a whole series of different roles in different ways over the years. Now the IPCC is essentially, it's the body which is set up by the UN to advise governments of the world. So the panel itself, that's the word in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The panel is actually the governments. So the governments actually are the panel. And the scientists like me actually, in a sense, advise the governments on that panel. And what we do in terms of that advice is try to bring together the best science we have, the best research we have about climate change in all its different respects. Everything from the very basic climate science through to the policies and social science and social outcomes and sustainable development goal linkages. And so what we do is, intermittently we bring out reports, and those reports are put together by the science community, but they're actually approved by the governments in that panel. So ultimately the governments own those products, and because they own the products, they actually take notice of them. And so if they didn't actually own them, in a sense, they'd just ignore them. And so by working with governments, it can often be a more extended process, but it actually ends up having a much greater impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So predominantly a lot of your roles is to do with climate science, but how did you become involved with climate science, and what drew you to that sort of career path?
Oh, look, I grew up on the coast within the stone's throw of the ocean, and and I spent an enormous amount of my time outside, whether it's surfing at the beach, sort of fishing, or or bushwalking or whatever, and of course the weather impacts on that tremendously. And so every day, in a sense, was interacting with the weather. And just like if I'd grown up on a farm or something, the weather is just so important. And then when I was a very early teenager, a cyclone came down the coast and actually blew the roof off our house. And so for me, extreme weather became very personal at that stage. And so I went from someone who just watched the weather forecasts on the TV so I can plot out my next day's activities, to someone who saw this as really really important and impacting heavily on people in different ways. And then when I went into my undergrad at uni, I did environmental science before environmental science was a thing in a way. And my honours thesis was actually on a coastal weed species, which and looking at the climatic and other ecological constraints on that coastal weed species. And then my PhD was on the tropical grasslands. So I went up to Townsville to do my PhD and looked at the grasslands in the sort of semi-arid tropics around there. And again, the climate comes into that because it's such a key driver of what goes on in those areas. And then subsequently, I moved into jobs in the state agencies, in Commonwealth agencies, CSIRO and now ANU, and looking at climate variability and climate change impacts on everything from water and biodiversity and urban systems and electricity, but particularly agriculture and food security.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I might test some of your climate knowledge here with these next couple of questions. So I've read some worrying reports saying that some scientists are now suggesting climate change is on track for a worst case scenario by the end of the century. Is this true? And if so, how much should the average person worry, do you think?
Yeah, we've actually been on worst case scenarios for a long, long time now. And so if you go back into the 90s, people were putting up scenarios of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, greenhouse gas emissions, temperature rise, sea level rise, and a range of other things. And so they had a range of scenarios which ranged from the very high level ones to the very low level ones. And almost consistently across those different indicators, we've been traveling along the high end of the most extreme high end of the high scenarios. And so we've been tracking on that worst case scenario for a long, long time. And that's allied particularly with the very fast economic development of parts of the world. So if we look at East Asia, for example, lesser extent South Asia and Africa, we've had a tremendous spurt of economic activity and population growth, and that's been driving that sort of tracking along the high-end scenarios. So the question as to whether we should worry about it, well, I think so. Not just because I work on this, but because we actually see the impacts happening right in front of our eyes. So whether it's the Black Summer fires or Black Saturday, or the fires in California, the heat waves which have just kept on sweeping the world, the shrinkage of the Arctic and the consequences of the biology there, the way in which sea level is rising and is accelerating in its rise, and the list goes on. And there's just a huge amount of stuff which is happening right now, and not much of it's good for Australia. Yeah. When we actually look at how this impacts on Australia, it's actually not a good story. We're getting drier. There's less water in our dams, less water in the Murray-Darling. Agriculture's already taken a huge hit in terms of profitability. We're seeing extreme events which are costing us billions of dollars and hurting people and hurting the environment. And again, the list goes on. And so I think we do have to worry. We've seen all of these impacts at around about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial, and we're heading towards 2 degrees or 3 or 4 degrees at the moment. And as a consequence, those sorts of impacts are just going to get worse and worse.
Yeah, Drawing on what you were saying near the end there with how we're heading on 2 degrees, 3 degrees and 4 degrees. So a global temperature increase of 1 degree sounds insignificant sometimes, but with what you were saying with the impacts of what that could be, what is the magnitude of the effects that would happen if we were to hit the 3 or 4 degrees temperature shift?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michaela. Most people don't actually have any feel at all for what 1 degree means as a global temperature increase. So, the difference between a 22 and a 23 degree day for us is almost negligible. We wouldn't really even detect it. And yet 1 degree globally is huge. And to illustrate that is that the temperature difference between the last ice age and our historical temperatures is around about 5 degrees. So the difference between a world which had, kilometres of ice over Europe and parts of North America, the sea level was 120 metres below where it is now. That's 5 degrees. So 5 degrees doesn't sound a lot. Again, the difference between 21 and 26 degrees, it's a cool but a nice day and a warm but a nice day, it doesn't, 5 degrees doesn't really hit us too hard. But 5 degrees globally is the difference between an ice age and an interglacial. And it had just massive impacts on the world. And so when we talk about 1 degree, that's a fifth of an ice age. When we talk about 2.5 degrees, it's half like an ice age's worth of temperature change, but in the other direction. So that's what we're doing to the world. And what sound like small numbers are actually really, really big. So when we actually start to look at, 3 degrees or 4 degrees. So at the moment, with the current agreements under the Paris Agreement to reduce our emissions, they won't achieve the Paris emission temperature goals, which is well below 2 degrees is the main goal, and if possible 1.5 degrees is the aspirational goal. Currently our commitments won't get us there. Even if everyone did what they say they'd do, we'd still head towards about 3 degrees. And 3 degrees would, basically we wouldn't have a Great Barrier Reef with live colourful corals and all of the fish that depend on it and all the productivity that comes from it. Our agriculture would be very seriously compromised. Murray-Darling Basin would have something like between a bit over a third and up to 2/3 of its water reduced. The issues over in WA in terms of low rainfall would be exacerbated, and it would be in really significant constraints. We would have heat waves which would potentially be occurring up to about a third of the year. So a third of the days each year would be heat waves in some parts of Australia. And again, the list goes on, and none of this is particularly good for Australia.
No, that's terrible. As you were saying that the lack of understanding with knowing what 1 degree, the impacts of that is, I think education is really critical and crucial in developing that understanding with people, but also in shifting attitudes on climate change and ensuring the behavioural change required for climate change is mitigated. What would you say to my school's principal, the principal team and the school's leadership team in terms of their responsibility to ensure students understand and can act on the problems associated with climate change?
Okay. You raise a really important point, which I was going to raise next as well. And that is, there's two sides of this coin. One is the doom and gloom story, which is climate change is terrible and, we don't want to go there. The other side of this coin is what can we do about it? And that's the positive sort of messages, I think, which are really important, because if we only send negative messages, it disempowers people, it turns people off, it makes people feel, what can I do about this? And they give up. And we don't want people to give up, because this is such an important issue for my generation and for your generation and for the next ones as well. And so really important, I think, to have those conversations, which are also about, yes, be concerned about climate change, but also be empowered to do something about climate change. And that comes in two different forms. One is reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that we can. And the other is adapting to climate change. So it's actually changing what we do, changing the houses we build and changing the clothes we wear and changing the agriculture we have, changing our water use habits and things like that. But in terms of the emission reduction, at the moment, there's a lot of pressure being pushed down on individuals, people like you and I, and, almost like it's a bit of a blame thing, like, flight blaming and, you're sort of guilt tripping on climate change. Oh, you're eating meat, you're a bad person sort of thing. And I don't think that's really helpful. And to some extent, this is actually almost subtly being pushed down on us by companies and governments, like pushing down onto the individual the responsibility. Whereas actually what needs to happen is there has to be a shared responsibility. So the responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions does partly come from us as individuals and our choices we make. But those choices are made in the context of the products that are available for us to buy and the policies and government incentives and programs which give us information and which give us options and which direct particular behaviours such as promoting EV usage, electric vehicle usage. And we actually, I think as individuals, yes, we need to change what we do, but we also need to push back up the chain into the businesses through statements about what we're going to prepare to buy. If, we're not going to buy your product because it actually has too big a carbon footprint, and into governments and saying what we're getting isn't good enough and we actually want more. And so I think what we have to do is actually operate at multiple levels, and we have to have the information needed to operate at those multiple levels. So what I'd be saying to your principal is give us that information, give us that training, give us that understanding of what the problem is and what the solutions are, but also get your own act together in terms of the greenhouse gas footprint of your school and of the behaviours around that school, which includes don't get mum to drive you to school and pick you up to take you back home, or dad to do that, because I shouldn't be sexist and genderist. Ride your bike or walk. And because there's a greenhouse gas footprint from that car trip, and you don't have to do it in most circumstances. And so get the school to get its act together, get you as a student body to get your act together and actually support each other in really pro-environmental behaviours.
Yeah, absolutely. On the topic of being solution-focused and solution-driven, there's one solution that the Eco team has come across, which is the carbon capture, which is something that has been floating around as a method that could possibly extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and decrease the impacts of climate change. Is this simply a pipe dream, or is this based in fact?
Yeah, so good one. So when people talk about carbon capture, almost automatically they go to carbon capture and storage, which is a technology which has been proposed for a long time, like 20 years or more, which often was taking the carbon dioxide from coal-fired power stations and capturing that and then pumping it underground. And billions of dollars have been spent across the globe on trying to do this, and virtually no real examples exist which are commercially viable to do that, except where that carbon dioxide is captured to pump back into the ground to extract more oil. And so in fact, it increases the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced. Even just this week, I think it's the last commercial carbon capture and storage facility in the US closed down because it was no longer viable, because renewables have pushed down the price of electricity, and so even with government subsidies, it's no longer viable. And so big question mark over the viability of that as a partial solution. And that's really important, because some people are still promoting putting in coal-fired power stations or gas-fired electricity stations, and saying, oh yeah, but we're just going to hook it up to carbon capture and storage and it's going to solve the problem. They're going to be green fossil fuel stations, if that makes sense. And that's grossly overstating the likely benefits or ability to implement carbon capture and storage. Now, there's a completely different idea there, which is one I think you're talking about, which is what we call carbon capture and use, or sometimes negative emission technologies, and there's various other names. And that's about ideas about how do you get carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, either using biological or chemical techniques, and then incorporating that carbon dioxide into useful products or into biological or other storages. And there's a lot of work going around the globe on that, and some of it's really prospective. It's looking really positive. And so we can do it, with trees and grass and soil carbon in farms, although often that's overstated as what could be done and the ease with which it can be done. There's also some really nice ideas about how we can capture that carbon dioxide and produce synthetic fuels from that. So there's already big prototypes working in various parts of the world, or capturing that carbon dioxide and putting it underground, but not sort of doing the carbon dioxide injection. It's actually incorporating it into the crystal structure of different geological formations, and it's locked up forever, basically. Or putting it into polymers, which we can make products, so the chairs we're sitting on at the moment, or to some extent the cars we drive and the buildings we sit in. And so there's some really I think great potential innovations here, and I think that's really important for Australia, partly because we have a great advantage in terms of renewable electricity and cheap electricity to actually make these things happen. We've got a great bunch of minds, like we're a creative bunch of people with really good training and expertise. We've got great governance systems, so we run ourselves pretty well usually, and I think we've got a populace who really wants action on climate change. So surveys show 90% of Australians want more action on climate change. And so I think we've got a great sort of setup here to do this. And it just, I think, requires a government who needs to actually make this happen, who needs to say, yes, this is actually an opportunity for us. It dodges us a bullet on climate change, and it'll make us a lot of export money, and it'll make us Australians feel really good about ourselves, that we're part of the solutions. And one other thing, at the moment, Australia's economy is incredibly simplified. Yeah. We've got, a huge amount of our economy is in a few sectors, iron ore extraction, coal and gas, etc., and agriculture. And we've got a very low diversification economy. So our economic diversity is almost as bad as Saudi Arabia or one of those countries. We actually need to massively increase the diversity of our economy to actually have a sustainable future here in Australia. And this is part of that economic diversification pathway. So looking at all of those multiple ways in which we can actually be really smart and produce high value green products, not just out of carbon dioxide type stuff, but much more broadly, and export our smarts to the world, because that's where our future lies.
Absolutely. I just have two more questions for you. My second last question is, what do you think is the greatest misconception on climate science in our society?
Well, one of the big ones is that, well, there's a few. I'll give you two out of several, but one of them is that climate change is a thing for the future, that this is a 2050 or a 2070 thing, and so we don't have to do anything now. And yet it's absolutely crystal clear that climate change is happening now and humans are causing it. And so it's a problem for now, and then we should be acting right now. The second one is that action on climate change will be incredibly costly. It'll cost us jobs. It'll cost us economic growth. It'll be bad for people. And all the evidence is showing that the opposite is true, is that responding to climate change can actually be good for the economy. Whole countries are actually on the pathway of a renewal for their economy and for their society based on climate action. There's far more jobs in terms of renewable electricity than there are in coal or similar things, or coal or gas. And they can be really good jobs, really high value, high tech jobs that people feel proud to do. So that's one of the big myths, is that climate action on climate change is going to cost the Earth, whereas in fact action on climate change will save the Earth.
So recently, Scott Morrison announced his plan to be have net zero emissions by 2050. You and I both know that this needs to happen sooner in order to stay in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, but also to try and keep under the 1 degree limit. However, do you think Australia can fall in line with the Paris Climate Agreement of having net zero emissions by 2030? Or is Scott Morrison's plan the best and most efficient way of tackling Australia's renewable switch?
What I understood the Prime Minister said was that we would preferably go to net zero by 2050, which is not a commitment. It's a general preference. And what I think we do need to do is actually have some firm commitments. And those commitments are not just about going to net zero by any given time. So I think 120 countries now have got net zero by 2050 commitments. So we're not going to be leading if we actually make that commitment. We'll be in the second half of the pack, as it were. So it's not as though that's an adventurous statement to make or an adventurous commitment to make. As you point out, though, is that to stay below 1.5 degrees, we actually have to be going net zero probably by 2045 or maybe even a little bit earlier now, because we've actually produced really significant amounts of greenhouse gas in the last couple of years. So those initial 2050, net zero by 2050 estimates were based on the Ipcc special report, which was published in 2018 and based on analyses in 2017. So in the 3 and a bit years since then, that we've actually been emitting our greenhouse gases, in fact, to a higher extent than we did before. We actually increased our emissions up to 2020, where we reduced them slightly because of COVID. And so because we actually didn't start the emission reduction trajectory early, 3 years ago, that 2050 should actually now be like a 2045 target. And it's not just the end point which is important, but it's actually the middle goals, the 2030 and 2040 goals. And they have to be consistent with that sort of end point at 2045, or even more than consistent. So we have to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions really early. And you might say, oh, that's hard, like starting early. But the ACT has already done that. So where I live in Canberra, our government has already reduced emissions by something like 45% or more by going entirely renewable electricity. So by generating a huge amount of wind and solar, we're now effectively green electricity. And so you can actually make a really big start on this, and you can get your emissions down well before 2030 by just being proactive in terms of renewables. And then, of course, then comes the much more difficult sectors, transport and home heating and cooling and waste management and agriculture and things like that. And so, my view is let's make big progress on the easy ones as quickly as we can, because we're going to need time to solve the more difficult ones. And so I actually think we should be being ambitious in terms of our midterm goals and be ambitious in terms of the net zero timing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time meeting with me, Professor Howden. I learnt so much from just talking to you. I have so many more questions to ask you, but I'll wrap it up here. But thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to meet with me. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Michaela, and I hope you have a great end of the day, but also that your whole school year goes really well and you do fantastically.